So first thing we want to remember is that China had lost internal control after the Boxer Rebellion. Remember the Boxer Rebellion and Dowager Cixi, and she appointed a 2-year-old named Puyi. And so that is going to be the last thing you should remember for the last dynasty in China, the Qing dynasty, which, if you remember, was ruled by a non-ethnically Chinese people. They were Manchu, actually, but some scholars argue that they became Chinese or were Sinicized. So if we pick up from there, there's this power vacuum that's been left behind. So remember that the Boxer Rebellion caused European troops to be stationed in China, and China had been carved up into what we call spheres of influence by these imperialist powers, and Japan was one of those imperialist powers. So the Qing dynasty was more or less discredited. It was weak. By 1911, there was a revolution to overthrow that last emperor, the one that Cixi had appointed as emperor when he was a 2-year-old boy. So that emperor is going to be have to abdicate, give up his throne. There's a really good movie called The Last Emperor. It starts with Dowager Cixi, appointing Puyi as the next emperor. Again, you could watch this potentially for extra credit related to our class. So you can watch that and learn a little bit more about it. So the Qing dynasty falls, and there's this period of war. A man named Dr. Sun Yat-sen is going to claim that there's a new government created, and it's a republic. Remember, a republic is an indirect democracy like in the United States of America. So the problem is he's not really in control. There were many, many warlords that were remnants of the leftover Qing dynasty that were creating problems, taking parts of China, reasserting the opium trade. They're contributing to many of the economic problems and political problems of China. That's one problem. You have other issues, including the rise of communist powers in Japan, but we'll get into that after I talk about the economic problems we'll talk about all the issues that are hurdles for this dynasty. First thing, just like in India, you have the rise of Indian nationalism. In China, you might ask yourself, what helped lead to an increase in Chinese nationalism? And one of those things was the 1919 Paris Peace Conference after World War I. Many of the Chinese intellectuals, the smartest people in China, assumed, because of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, that after the end of World War I, that the European powers would support self-determination and end imperialist influence in China, and they were disappointed, disillusioned, and grew cynical when the Europeans and the United States did not support an end to this imperialism. And so that caused many intelligent Chinese people to become more interested in the alternative model, which was not a Republican form of government, not one that looks like the United States in democracy. Of course, the other model in town, the historical context is the Soviet Union, which was the creation, the communist state that was created after the Russian Revolution. You know about the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War. So Chinese people, they were indignant with the fact that the Europeans and the United States were hypocritical after World War I and didn't support Chinese independence and Chinese nationalism. So the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, is created, and many people came to believe, as Sean Fay did, in all of these communist values, which included more rights for women. So you have some people that are communist and other people that prefer a Republican form of government. Dr. Sun Yat-sen wanted to end the special privileges for foreigners, wanted economic development, wanted a Republican democratic form of government. And so he's not communist, but he's going to create an institution called the Gaomindang, also sometimes called the Kuomintang. And this is because of the way that we transliterate Chinese. We used to use something called the Wade-Giles system, and now we use the pinyin system. So you'll see it sometimes referred to as the KMT instead. So just be aware that some of the different spellings, pronunciations have to do with the way that we used to transliterate Chinese and the change to how we do it now. So the Gaomindang used to augment its ranks, or kind of fill in, support its ranks with people that were communist. And for a while, they worked together to try to fight for Chinese nationalism and oust the foreigners. Okay, the problem is, after Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925, the person that takes power is Jiang Jieshi if you use the pinyin system, or Chiang Kai-shek if you use the Wade-Giles system. And this was a young leader that really hated the communists, and he is going to turn against the communists. So let me start with, he launches something called the Northern Expedition that was going to unify the nation. But at the end of the Northern Expedition, he's going to turn against the communists and he's going to start to attack and kill them. And they're going to retreat to an area in southeastern China to regroup, reorganize. So we'll come back to what happens to the Guomindang in a moment, but there's one crisis that China doesn't have to deal with that's part of the historical context, and that is the Great Depression. They don't have to deal with the Great Depression because at that point in time, they didn't have a large industrial part of their economy. They were largely agrarian, and so at least that isn't going to affect them. They do have three other problems to deal with, by the way. Here's Jiang Jieshi, and here is Mao Zedong, who I'm going to tell you becomes the most important Chinese CCP ruler. He's going to create his own version of communism called Maoism that puts a lot of emphasis on the peasants and the villagers being the leaders of a revolution. So your book's going to talk to you about some of the problems that China has to contend with. First, it's not really, this government isn't really in control. There's a lot of warlords who have power. You also have the rise of communism, and lastly, the Guomindang or the KMT also had to deal with the Japanese. So Jiang Jieshi or Chiang Kai-shek, he's going to focus on the CCP threat. Eventually, the Chinese communists are going to break through this place where they've been sort of forced to go into hiding and engage in an over 6,000 mile long march to try to get to a place where they can start to fight against the Guomindang. This long march causes many, many people to see the bravery of the Chinese communists and to side with the Chinese communists. So the Long March is really, it has a long-term effect of bringing the Chinese peasantry closer to the Communist Party. During that period of history, someone emerges as the dominant voice of the communists, and that is Mao Zedong. He was a former teacher and a librarian who really believed in communist ideas, but his version of communism put a larger emphasis on peasants leading the revolution rather than industrial proletariats. And that makes sense because of China at that time. There weren't a lot of industrial proletariats. You should know the difference between Maoism versus, say, Leninism or Marxism. They're all types of communism, but they have different sort of beliefs. Okay, so make sure you know about that and that you know about the Long March.